In one of the most chanted Buddhist teachings, the Sutta on setting the will, the Dharma in motion, there's a stanza that simply says this: birth is stressful, aging is stressful, death is stressful, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair are stressful. Association with the unbeloved is stressful. Separation from the loved is stressful. Not getting what you want is stressful. It's one of my favorite passages. I find it a really helpful reminder, and I use it, the formula, as a way of bringing my awareness into focus, because otherwise these little irritations can creep in and lead me astray. But it rubs some people the wrong way, and I can understand that. After all, we live in a society where a very common solution to addressing stress and suffering is simply to distract yourself long enough until the problem hopefully goes away. And if that doesn't work, we generally default to using coercion. We'll force our way through if ignoring it doesn't get the result we intend. Neither of those strategies are generally healthy or happy over the long term, but we become accustomed to them. If that's what we're used to doing, then we become used to the results. So much so that it may eventually even feel normal for our basic needs to go unmet, especially our social and emotional needs, for our emotions to become suppressed and repressed, and for our suffering to simmer right beneath the surface. When we don't have adequate tools to manage our stress, let alone transform our stress, it's natural to turn away from things that remind us of that suffering, like the Buddha's verse that I read. This kind of dynamic even became a running joke for one international organization I worked with in Cambodia. It was an international organization, and the local leaders were stationed, Americans or Canadians who were stationed there in Cambodia. But the staff was a mix of local Khmer folks who were there for the long haul and Americans who were on fixed contracts, and usually they were really short contracts. Like my contract was for 3 years. Whenever there was an American who didn't quite fit in, or who ended up doing disrespectful things, especially culturally disrespectful things, and there was a conflict, the first question the organizational leaders asked was, well, how much longer is that person's contract? If the person was leaving in a few months, then it was considered easier to just let things slide, to ignore the problem, because it was literally going to go away across the ocean in a few months. Only if the troublesome person was going to be around for quite a bit longer did the leaders seriously consider trying to even address the situation. And those made for a lot of kind of funny stories, but it also supported some really unhealthy organizational habits. And maybe the most prominent of these was to create a sense of powerlessness when it came to managing relational conflict. Ultimately, we were encouraged to put everything aside and just endure unhealthy relationships, because that was easier than giving our time and energy and learning to skillfully navigate those inevitable ups and downs. That whole approach is obviously impractical, because relational stress and suffering is part of the human experience. And guess what? The more it became a common refrain to say, well, they're only going to be here for a few more months, the easier it became to make that approach a habit to every conflict and every relationship that we had. The reality of our stress and suffering when it comes to relationships includes the Buddha's simple observation I read before. Association with the unbeloved, the people you don't like, is stressful. Separation from the people you love is stressful. And we end up spending a fair bit of our lives around people that we'd rather avoid, wishing we were spending time with other people we find it easier to like and to love. It's not exactly a recipe for happiness, and it can nourish resentment and isolation. Oppressive systems and cultures just intensify that dynamic too, and the resulting suffering perpetuates both the harm and the systems that benefit from that harm. There's a lot in this dynamic that deserves our attention, including the ways we form healthy relationships or get stuck in unhealthy patterns. And one of those patterns is our tendency to attach so strongly to a group identity that we become unaware of how our relationships shape and influence us, especially in our collective isolation and loneliness. I know that sounds like a paradox, but we have this kind of cultural accommodation to being isolated and lonely. And when we are in that position, we can be so desperate for other people's company that we lose sight of the practice of community, and we lose the practice of discernment in community. Going along with our group, the one I belong to, whatever they believe or do, becomes an expression of my belonging. It's how I say I belong, that I do and say what they do. Protecting our group identity gives us some feeling of safety, and we can't risk losing that. But we've discovered again and again that this is a recipe not for wisdom, but for getting lost in confirmation biases and even falling prey to conspiracy theories. Without reflective tools and critical thinking, anyone who agrees with us, it's pretty simple to just consider them the wise ones, or at least the right ones. And anyone who disagrees with us, it's easy to dismiss as foolish. And we don't often think about it any more deeply than that. And when a group identity is being preserved, thinking about it can actually feel like a threat that those other folks who say I'm wrong are out to get me. It's harder to take the time to really discern how our actions impact one another. It's not automatic to practice with the insight that our relationships are actively training our minds. Whom we spend time with is also a question of how we spend our time. What activities do we do together? What do we talk about? Where do we go? The people in our lives both reflect and influence what we think is important, how we treat one another, how we understand life and the world, for good or for ill. Being intentional about a community helps us create habits that help and heal instead of harm. The Buddhist Discourse on Happiness that we began talking about last week reminds us that though this takes time, energy, and effort, it is worth it, because the way we relate with each other is itself a spiritual and reflective practice. In that next verse of the Discourse, we read, "Not to associate with fools, but to associate with the wise, and to honor those worthy of honor. That is the greatest good fortune." In the Buddhist teaching, the difference between a wise person and a fool doesn't come down to knowledge as much as it comes down to what we do. As the Buddha said in the Lakkhana Sutta, a fool is characterized by their actions. A wise person is characterized by their actions. It's through the activities of one's life that one's discernment shines. And a fool is someone, in the Buddha's perspective, who causes harm by what they do, say, or think, that increases suffering. A wise person is someone who knows how to restrain themselves from doing hurtful things, and instead is skillful in saying, doing, and thinking things that bring about an end to suffering. They act with understanding and compassion. A basic framework for discerning this foolishness and wisdom in the Buddhist tradition is one that will be really familiar to you. It's a basic moral code called the 5 precepts. And they're popularly expressed as don't kill, don't steal, don't commit sexual misconduct, don't lie, and don't consume intoxicants that cloud the mind, that encourage you to do something foolish. But as a living tradition, the precepts are richer even than those 5 kind of rules. They're a reflective practice in themselves. An example of this comes from the Plum Village tradition. As a community under the leadership of the Most Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh, and beginning in the midst of the Vietnam War. And I think that's a really important thing. The early drafts of what I'm about to read was born in the midst of the Vietnam War, when they started reimagining each of those 5 precepts as a reflective practice. They explain that the 5 mindfulness trainings have their root in the 5 precepts offered by the Buddha. They've been expanded and updated so that they represent a way to bring mindfulness into every area of life. rather than hard and fast rules, they offer us a framework to reflect on our actions, speech, and thinking so we can create more happiness for ourselves and for the world around us. We can look at the second precept to see what this means. That precept is often presented as a prohibition against stealing, and it is that. But the literal wording already reveals a rich reflection on how we relate to what we think about as, or what we want to be, our possessions. And that precept literally is translated as, I undertake the precept to abstain from taking that which isn't given. The second mindfulness brings a more direct awareness of how those relationships operate today. It reads, aware of the suffering caused by exploitation, social injustice, stealing, and oppression, I'm committed to practicing generosity in my thinking, speaking, and acting. I'm determined not to steal and not to possess anything that should belong to others, and I will share my time, energy, and material resources with those who are in need. I will practice looking deeply to see that the happiness and suffering of others are not separate from my own happiness and suffering, that true happiness is not possible without understanding and compassion, and that running after wealth, fame, power, and sensual pleasures can bring much suffering and despair. I'm aware that happiness depends on my mental attitude and not on external conditions, and that I can live happily in the present moment by remembering that I already have more than enough conditions to be happy. I'm committed to practicing right livelihood so that I can reduce the suffering of living beings on earth and stop contributing to climate change. All of that reflection, born from that single simple precept, I undertake the precept to abstain from taking what is not given. This is a concrete example of what the Buddha was speaking about when he said that it's through the activities of one's life that one's discernment shines, the discernment to choose between what's foolish, what causes suffering, and what's wise, that brings about well-being. In another sutta named The Fool and the Wise Person, the Buddha notes that both foolish and wise people deal with the same conditions in life. We don't get to choose like, oh, if you're wise, you get these better, easier conditions to live with. And it doesn't work that way. We all have the same conditions, but it's how we respond to them that makes the difference. We have the conditions of being obstructed by ignorance and conjoined with craving, in the Buddha's words, sensitive to pleasure and pain. And the difference is in how we respond. The fool has not practiced the holy life for the right ending of stress. The wise person has practiced. It is in our actions that we discern what's foolish that brings about suffering, and what's wise that brings about happiness and well-being. Looked at in this way, we recognize our foolishness is whatever leaves us caught in a cycle of unhappy and unhealthy, harmful behavior, and our wisdom is what brings us increasing well-being, happiness, and freedom. This practice isn't obviously a get better fast kind of cure. It doesn't magically make oppressive systems disappear, for example, but it can help us understand those systems and both our suffering from and our complicity with those oppressive systems. And it reminds us that the wise person is always paying attention to how our decisions impact ourselves and those around us, bringing what is outside of our awareness, what is lurking in the shadows of our mind, into our awareness. We can ask, what happens when I do it this way? Does this lead to more suffering in myself, others, and the world? Or does this lead to more well-being, inclining toward happiness and awakening? This is how we can care for our practice and one another, cultivating wisdom and compassion. And the more of us who are practicing like this, the more space we make in our communities for happiness to actually become possible. It's a long-term practice. Wisdom cannot be rushed because wisdom requires this kind of observation over time. We build trust in our practice and with one another, and that also takes time to build a relationship, to build trust. In the Tana Sutta, the Buddha taught that it's through living together that a person's virtue may be known, and then only after a long period, not a short period, by one who is attentive, not by one who is inattentive, by one who is discerning. not by one who is not discerning. And he explains the same thing through looking at purity, that ability to understand what is actually good for us, and endurance to do it over a long time, and the discernment in discussing that the things we say reflect the insights we've had. And we do that all, over a long period, not a short period, by one who is attentive, not by one who is inattentive, by one who is discerning, not by one who is not. Our willingness and commitment to practice like that for a long time, not for a short period, is part of the practice itself. My teacher will often say, "I'm watching for the practice." This is part of developing trust and deepening friendship. And when we take the long view of our practices, we give ourselves a real opportunity to learn. It takes that patience to grow and learn. What are our strengths? Where do we have room to grow? Do we see some patterns in our life where we could, I'm kind of foolish that way. I could use some wisdom there. Do we see weak points where a habit has already grown into harm, or where it could grow into harm? How do we handle those tough times, and where do we find support and help? When do we feel like quitting? When have we quit? If you could eavesdrop on your conversations, what would it tell you about your own discernment? By paying attention like this over a long time, we develop our skills for discernment. We come to better know what is foolish and what is wise because we have taken time to better recognize in our own lives what has harmed us and others and what has helped us and others. And we're doing this pretty well constantly anyway, but we're not always doing it intentionally. And if we can do it intentionally, that's what really brings the growth. Where it's possible, then, we want to spend as much time with others who encourage these kinds of skills that create conditions for wisdom and well-being. Over time, we naturally change our habits and pastimes to align with what we've learned. The more we pay attention, the more we notice the changes. This isn't to say that some habits and situations won't resist change, because some of those things are really tough and take a lot of creativity and support and effort. There may be many reasons, and not all of them are in our control or easily influenced. For today, I just want to acknowledge that those kinds of limitations exist. But by acknowledging that, it's also important to remember that those limitations make it even more important to prioritize our relationships with people who support us and our well-being. As much as possible, we want to make choices that give us that opportunity. And that brings us to the final part of the stanza, an awareness and appreciation of the connection between honoring those who are worth honoring and happiness. As Thanissaro Bhikkhu teaches us, respect is the attitude you develop toward the things that matter in your life. Practically speaking, this connects with how we learn, which supports the cultivation of wisdom. He would go on to write, "If you truly love yourself, you have to pay close attention to the way reality really works and act accordingly. Not everything you think or feel is worthy of respect. You can't simply indulge in the pleasure or resist the pain coming from your own actions. You have to learn from both pleasure and pain, to show them respect as events in a causal chain, to see what they have to teach you." Practicing in this way, honoring others who have cultivated this kind of wisdom and compassion, it comes easily. You want to honor them. The better we understand the effort and energy required to stay on the path, the easier it is to recognize and honor it in others. This isn't the unhealthy, naive trust that comes from delusion, but the healthy, heedful trust of recognizing someone who compassionately understands life, understands themselves, understands each other, us. When we stop ourselves from doing something harmful, the primary motivation will not be fear or shame of being caught, but the compassionate understanding of how to cultivate happiness and well-being. Dishonor and disrespect, in the end, they close us off from learning what we need to learn. Sticking with a wise person who can help us understand and transform greed, hatred, and delusion within us, That takes our own virtue, endurance, discernment. It's a virtuous cycle, and gratitude arises with the discernment. Honor and respect arise naturally out of our own well-being and happiness. And that's why I think it's a wonderful thing to consider friendship to actually be a reflective, a spiritual practice. As the Buddha said, not to be associated with the foolish ones, to live in the company of wise people, honoring those who are worth honoring. That is the greatest happiness. Thank you.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.